The morning sun had just started peeking through the trees at Patterson Park, casting warm golden rays across the dewy grass. For Mira, a 16-year-old who lived just 2 blocks away, this was her favorite time of day. The world felt fresh and full of possibilities as she laced up her worn but comfortable running shoes on her front porch. Her mom had always told her that morning exercise would help her focus better in school, but truthfully, Mira just loved the peaceful feeling of having the park almost to herself. The only sounds were birds chirping their morning songs and the gentle rustle of leaves in the spring breeze. As she started her usual stretching routine, she could smell the fresh bread from old Mr. Lee's bakery down the street, a morning tradition that always made her stomach rumble. Today was special, though. After months of training, she was finally feeling confident about the upcoming track meet. Her coach had noticed her improved timing, and there was a real chance she could qualify for the state championships. Each morning jog brought her one step closer to that dream. As she began her run, following the familiar path that wound through the park, Mira waved to the usual morning crowd. There was the kind newspaper vendor setting up his stand, the elderly couple who always walked their golden retriever, and the group of retired friends who gathered for their morning Tai Chi sessions. These familiar faces had become part of her morning routine, making the park feel like an extension of home. She pulled out her phone to check her running app, making sure to keep her pace steady. Her brother had helped her create the perfect training playlist, a mix of upbeat songs that kept her motivated without being too distracting. The morning air was crisp and clear, filling her lungs with each breath as her feet found their rhythm on the path. Mira thought about her younger sister, who had been begging to join her morning runs. Maybe it was time to let her tag along, even if it meant slowing down a bit. After all, these peaceful mornings had taught her more than just running. They'd shown her how to find quiet moments in a busy world, how to push through when she felt tired, and how to appreciate the simple joy of movement. The park was slowly coming to life around her. Early morning joggers nodded in greeting as they passed, and a few people had started setting up for the weekend farmers market. She loved how the community came together in this space, everyone sharing the same paths and moments, even if they were all there for different reasons. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Mira picked up her pace slightly. She had gotten better at pacing herself over the months, learning to save energy for the final stretch. Her breathing was steady, and her steps felt light. It was shaping up to be a perfect training session. Little did she know that in just a few minutes, this ordinary morning would transform into something extraordinary. As she rounded the bend near her favorite oak tree, the one with branches that seemed to reach out like welcoming arms, Mira noticed something unusual ahead. The morning light was creating long shadows across the path, and among them, a figure on a bench caught her attention. At first glance, it seemed like just another person taking a rest, but something didn't feel quite right. This moment would test everything she had learned in her first aid training last summer, though she didn't know it yet. Her heart was beating steadily from her run, her ponytail swaying with each step, as she approached the bench that would change not just her morning, but her entire perspective on what it means to be ready for the unexpected. The peaceful morning was about to take a turn that would prove that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear running shoes and carry nothing more than a phone and a willingness to help. Something wasn't quite right about the way the elderly man was sitting on the bench. Mira slowed her pace, her running shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. The morning sun was now higher in the sky, and she could clearly see that he was hunched over in an unusual way. His hand was pressed against his chest, and even from a distance, she noticed his face looked unusually pale. Other people walked past, most absorbed in their own morning routines. A woman talking on her phone barely glanced his way. Two friends deep in conversation about weekend plans strolled right by. Maybe they thought he was just taking a break or enjoying the morning air. But Mira couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She remembered how her grandmother used to say that gut feelings were like little whispers from our hearts telling us to pay attention. Right now, that whisper was getting louder with each step. The man's blue jacket reminded her of the one her grandfather often wore on his morning walks, and maybe that's why she felt especially drawn to check on him. As she got closer, she noticed more details that made her heart beat faster, and not from her morning run. His breathing seemed labored, and there was a slight tremor in his hands. He was trying to reach for something in his pocket, but seemed to be struggling with even that simple movement. The morning breeze carried the sound of this shallow breathing. A young couple jogged past, their matching neon running gear bright against the green park backdrop. They were focused on their fitness trackers, counting steps and calories, unaware of the scene unfolding just a few feet away. Mira thought about just continuing her run too. After all, what if she was overreacting? What if he just wanted to be left alone? But then she remembered the first aid course instructor's words from last summer. When in doubt, reach out. The worst that can happen is you might feel a little embarrassed. But the best that can happen, you might save a life. Those words echoed in her mind as she made her decision. The morning had grown warmer, but Mira felt a chill as she approached the bench. Up close, she could see beads of sweat on the man's forehead despite the mild temperature. His complexion had a grayish tinge that seemed very wrong. He looked up at her with eyes that showed both confusion and relief, as if he had been hoping someone would notice him but couldn't find the strength to call out for help. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. The usual park sounds, children's laughter from the playground, dogs barking in the distance, birds singing in the trees, all faded into the background. Mira's focus narrowed to just this bench and this person who clearly needed help. She noticed his fingers still trying to reach his pocket, his wedding ring glinting in the sunlight. A worn leather wallet had fallen near his feet, and a small shopping list written in neat handwriting had slipped out. Milk, bread, newspaper. Such ordinary items for what was turning into such an extraordinary morning. Other park regulars continued their normal routines around them. The Tai Chi group was still flowing through their graceful movements near the fountain. The maintenance worker was emptying trash bins along the path. Everything looked so normal, yet here was this moment that felt frozen in time, waiting for someone to take action. Mira took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she prepared to help. She didn't know it yet, but the next few minutes would test everything she knew about staying calm under pressure. The peaceful morning walk she had planned was about to turn into something much more important. A reminder that sometimes the most significant moments in life come disguised as ordinary days. All those mornings spent watching medical shows with her mom suddenly flashed through Mira's mind as she looked more closely at the elderly man. His name was Mr. Patel, she would later learn, and his face showed all the warning signs she'd been taught about in first aid class. His skin had taken on an ashy color, and the way he was pressing his hand against his chest made her stomach tighten with worry. "Sir," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "Are you feeling okay?" The words felt small in the morning air, but they were the beginning of something big. Mr. Patel tried to answer, but his breathing was too labored to form proper words. Instead, he looked at her with eyes that seemed to say thank you for noticing. The morning had grown busier around them. A group of kids rushed past with their soccer gear, their excited chatter about the upcoming game floating in the air. A man walking his dog paused briefly, glancing their way before continuing on his path. The newspaper vendor was doing brisk business just 50 yards away, completely unaware of the drama unfolding near his stand. Mira's hands trembled slightly as she noticed more symptoms. Mr. Patel's forehead was damp with sweat despite the mild morning temperature. His breathing was irregular, and he kept trying to loosen his collar as if it was too tight. She remembered her first aid instructor's voice clearly now. These are classic heart attack symptoms. Time is precious in these situations. The world seemed to slow down and speed up all at once. Her morning playlist was still playing softly through one earbud that had stayed in, some cheerful pop song that now felt strangely out of place. She gently pulled it out, needing to focus completely on what was happening. The contrast between the peaceful park morning and this moment of crisis felt surreal. A light breeze rustled through the trees above them, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. It was strange how such a beautiful morning could contain such a serious moment. Mr. Patel made another attempt to reach his pocket, his movements becoming more desperate. Mira noticed a small medical alert bracelet on his wrist catching the sunlight. She thought about her own grandfather, who lived across the city. How many times had he gone for his morning walks alone? How many other people might be like Mr. Patel right now, needing help but unable to ask for it? The thought made her more certain about what she needed to do. Her phone felt heavy in her pocket, the same phone she'd been using just minutes ago to check her running pace. Now it would serve a much more important purpose. But before she could reach for it, she needed to be absolutely sure about what she was seeing. Being wrong would be embarrassing, but being right and not acting quickly enough, that was unthinkable. Time seemed to crystallize into this one moment. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the park path. A few early morning workers hurried past, briefcases in hand, their minds already on their workday. The contrast between their routine morning and this critical moment struck Mira deeply. Mr. Patel's breathing had become more labored, and his face showed increasing distress. His wedding ring glinted as his hand clutched his chest tighter, and Mira noticed a small photo peeking out of his wallet that had fallen. A family picture, maybe of grandchildren waiting for him to come home from his morning walk. The first aid training poster from school flashed in her mind. Recognition is the first step in emergency response. Looking at Mr. Patel's symptoms, the pale, clammy skin, the chest pain, the difficulty breathing, everything aligned with what she'd been taught to watch for. This wasn't just someone taking a rest on a park bench. This was an emergency, and she was the only one who had noticed. The moment Mira decided to act felt like stepping off the edge of a diving board. That split second where you know there's no turning back. Her hand was already pulling out her phone, fingers moving almost on their own to dial 911. The morning sun caught the screen's surface as she pressed the numbers, her heart beating so loud she could hear it in her ears. "Stay with me, sir," she said softly to Mr. Patel as she waited for the call to connect. Those few seconds felt like hours. Around them, the park continued its morning routine. A street sweeper humming in the distance, early morning tennis players calling out scores, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from someone's travel mug as they walked past. The 911 operator's voice came through clear and steady. 911. What's your emergency? Mira took a deep breath, remembering how her teacher had always said that staying calm was just as important as acting quickly. Her voice shook slightly, but her words came out clear. "I'm at Patterson Park, near the east entrance. There's an elderly man who I think is having a heart attack." She surprised herself with how steady she kept her voice as she described the symptoms: the chest pain, the trouble breathing, the pale and sweaty skin. Years of watching her mom, a nurse, handle crisis situations had taught her more than she realized. The operator's voice was reassuring as she asked questions and gave instructions. "Put your phone on speaker," the operator advised, and Mira quickly complied. The morning air carried the operator's calm voice clearly. "Help is on the way. Stay with him. I'll guide you through what to do next." Mr. Patel's eyes met hers, showing both fear and gratitude. His hand reached out slightly, and without hesitation, she took it, giving it a gentle squeeze. The park had gotten busier, and a small crowd began to gather. An older woman stepped forward, introducing herself as a retired nurse. "I can help," she said, her voice carrying years of experience. Together, they made Mr. Patel as comfortable as possible while following the operator's instructions. The morning breeze had picked up, and someone offered their jacket as a makeshift pillow. Mira noticed Mr. Patel trying to say something, his hand still moving toward his pocket. Understanding dawned on her face. "Sir, do you have medicine you need to take?" He nodded weakly. With gentle movements, She helped him reach into his pocket, finding a small bottle of nitroglycerin spray. The retired nurse nodded approvingly as they helped him use it. Time seemed to move in strange ways, both incredibly slow and surprisingly fast. The sound of distant sirens grew steadily closer. Mira kept talking to Mr. Patel, telling him about her morning runs, her upcoming track meet, anything to keep him focused and conscious. She noticed his breathing seemed a bit easier after the medication, though he still looked frightened. The growing crowd of onlookers reminded her of a lesson from her first aid class. In emergencies, people often freeze, waiting for someone else to take charge. She was grateful she hadn't frozen, that she'd found the courage to be that someone. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the gathering of concerned faces. A young boy on a bicycle stopped to ask if he could help. Mira sent him to the park entrance to guide the ambulance to their location. His red bike flashed in the sunlight as he pedaled away, happy to have a mission. These small moments of kindness from strangers, the offered jacket, the retired nurse's help, the boy's eagerness to assist, reminded her that most people want to help. They sometimes just need someone to show them how. The sirens were very close now. Mira could see the flashing lights reflecting off the trees at the park entrance. She gave Mr. Patel's hand another gentle squeeze, noticing how his grip had remained steady throughout the ordeal. "Help is almost here," she said softly, amazed at how much had happened in what couldn't have been more than 10 minutes since she first noticed him on the bench. Following the 911 operator's calm instructions, Mira helped Mr. Patel sit in a more comfortable position on the bench. Her running shoes gripped the morning damp ground as she steadied herself beside him. The retired nurse, Mrs. Kumar, kept her hand on his wrist, monitoring his pulse with practiced ease. "The spray seems to be helping," Mrs. Kumar said softly, her experienced eyes watching Mr. Patel's face. His breathing had become a little less labored, though worry still creased his forehead. The morning light caught the small gold frame of family photo that had fallen from his wallet, a holiday picture showing him surrounded by smiling grandchildren. The young boy returned on his red bicycle, slightly out of breath. "The ambulance is turning into the park now," he announced proudly. Mira could hear the sirens getting closer, their sound bouncing off the trees. The morning joggers and dog walkers had stopped their routines, forming a respectful circle around the bench, ready to help if needed. Mr. Patel managed to whisper something, his voice barely audible above the approaching sirens. Mira leaned closer to hear. "My daughter. Need to call." She squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We'll call her as soon as the paramedics are here," she promised. She noticed his wedding ring again. 50 years of marriage, he would later tell her in the hospital. The morning had grown warmer, and someone offered a paper fan they'd made from a newspaper. The small gestures of kindness from strangers kept coming. A bottle of water, a folded sweater for cushioning, gentle words of encouragement. The park's usual morning symphony of birds and rustling leaves was now accompanied by the steady voices of people wanting to help. Mira kept talking to Mr. Patel, remembering how her first aid instructor had emphasized the importance of keeping a patient calm and engaged. She told him about her family's weekend plans, her little sister's art project, anything to keep his mind occupied. His eyes stayed focused on her, drawing strength from her steady presence. The ambulance lights painted the trees in flashing red and white as it approached along the park path. 2 paramedics quickly emerged, their movements efficient and practiced. The small crowd parted to make way, and Mira found herself stepping back as the professionals took over. She watched as they quickly set up their equipment, their quiet confidence reassuring everyone around them. "You did good, kid," the first paramedic said to Mira as she listed off everything she'd observed and done. The nitroglycerin spray was exactly the right call. The second paramedic was already setting up an ECG, his movements quick but gentle. The morning sun caught the silver of their equipment as they worked, their teamwork like a well-rehearsed dance. Mrs. Kumar stepped forward to share her observations about Mr. Patel's pulse and breathing changes. The paramedics nodded appreciatively. In emergencies, every piece of information helps. The young boy with the red bicycle had stayed nearby, his face showing a mixture of concern and fascination as he watched the paramedics work. Time seemed to move differently now that help had arrived. The crowd began to disperse slowly, though many lingered nearby, genuinely concerned about the outcome. Mira noticed how the morning light had shifted, casting different shadows across the park. Her running app was still paused, the screen showing a workout interrupted. But some things were more important than finishing a run. Mr. Patel managed a small smile as the paramedics prepared to move him to the ambulance. He reached for Mira's hand one more time, his grip stronger now. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes saying more than words could express. The morning breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers as the paramedics carefully helped him onto the stretcher, a reminder that life goes on, even in moments of crisis. The minutes crawled by like hours as Mira sat with Mr. Patel in the ambulance. The paramedics had invited her to ride along after learning his daughter was still on her way to the hospital. The inside of the ambulance smelled of disinfectant and rubber gloves, while the beeping of monitors created a steady rhythm that somehow made time feel both faster and slower. "Keep talking to him," the paramedic encouraged as she checked vital signs. "You're doing great." So Mira continued her story about her upcoming track meet, watching how Mr. Patel's eyes stayed focused on her words, using them as an anchor during the bumpy ride. The morning sun flickered through the ambulance windows, creating patterns that danced across the medical equipment. Through the small window, she could see the city waking up properly now. Store owners pulling up their shutters, office workers clutching coffee cups, school buses beginning their routes. All these normal morning moments continuing while inside the ambulance. Every second felt crucial. The paramedic moved with quiet efficiency, checking monitors and adjusting equipment. Mr. Patel's hand remained warm in hers, and his breathing seemed a bit easier now. She noticed a small prayer card that had fallen from his wallet earlier, the same kind her grandmother kept in her purse. These little details made him more than just someone she'd helped. They made him real, a person with a whole life of memories and loved ones waiting for him. "My grandchildren," he managed to whisper, pointing meekly at the family photo Mira had carefully saved from the park bench. "They're coming this weekend." His voice was thin but determined. The paramedic nodded encouragingly while adjusting his oxygen mask, and Mira squeezed his hand. "You'll have quite a story to tell them," she said, earning a small smile. The ambulance's siren created a bubble of urgency around them as they moved through the morning traffic. Inside, though, there was a sense of careful calm. The paramedic kept up a steady stream of quiet communication with her partner driving, using words Mira half remembered from medical shows but now understood were about blood pressure and heart rhythms. Through the window, she spotted the hospital's familiar shape growing larger. Her mom worked there as a nurse, and Mira had visited often enough to know the emergency entrance. But being here as part of an emergency was completely different from those casual visits. The morning sun glinted off the hospital's windows, almost too bright to look at directly. The paramedic began preparing for their arrival, her movements precise but gentle. "Your daughter will be waiting," she told Mr. Patel, "and the cardiac team is ready." Mira noticed how these simple words seemed to relax him slightly. Even in emergencies, knowing loved ones are near makes a difference. A memory flashed through Mira's mind. Last summer's first aid instructor saying, "Sometimes the most important thing you can do is just be there." She hadn't fully understood then, but now, watching Mr. Patel's relieved face as they pulled into the emergency bay, she got it. Sometimes being present was its own kind of medicine. The back doors of the ambulance swung open to organized activity. Hospital staff moved with purpose, their scrubs creating a sea of soft blue in the morning light. Mr. Patel gave Mira's hand one final squeeze before the transfer began. "Thank you," he whispered again, his eyes bright with gratitude. You turned my bad luck into a blessing. As the medical team efficiently moved Mr. Patel from the ambulance, Mira stood back, suddenly aware of her running clothes and sneakers among all the professional uniforms. A woman who looked like an older version of the girl in Mr. Patel's family photo rushed forward, his daughter arriving just in time. Their eyes met briefly, a world of gratitude passing between them without words. The hospital waiting room buzzed with quiet activity as Mira sat beside Mr. Patel's daughter, who had introduced herself as Priya. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, warming the worn fabric of the chairs. The morning had stretched into early afternoon, but Mira couldn't bring herself to leave until she knew Mr. Patel was okay. He always takes that same walk, Priya said softly, her hands wrapped around a cooling paper cup of coffee. Every morning for the past 20 years. Even after Mom passed away last year, he kept to his routine. She looked at Mira with eyes full of gratitude. If you hadn't been there today. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A nurse walked past, shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang. These ordinary hospital sounds seemed to emphasize how extraordinary the morning had been. Mira's running clothes felt out of place now, but she barely noticed anymore. Her phone buzzed, messages from her mom asking where she was. Mira quickly typed back, explaining everything. Her mom's response came instantly. "Honey, I'm so proud of you. Stay as long as you need." The simple words brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She hadn't realized how much tension she'd been holding in. "He's asking for you," a nurse said, appearing at their side. Her blue scrubs rustled as she led them down the hallway. The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and fresh coffee from the nurse's station. Every few steps, they passed rooms where other families were having their own important moments. Some happy, some sad, all part of life's big story. Mr. Patel was sitting up in bed, looking tired but much better than he had in the park. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside him, its rhythm somehow reassuring. Cards from the grandchildren's last visit decorated his bedside table, their bright colors standing out against the hospital white. When he saw Mira, his face lit up with a warm smile. "My guardian angel," he said, his voice stronger now. "The doctor said if you hadn't acted so quickly." He reached for her hand, and Mira took it, noticing how much warmer and steadier his grip felt. The afternoon sun through the window cast a peaceful glow over the room, so different from the urgent morning light in the park. A doctor came in, clipboard in hand, and confirmed what they'd all been hoping to hear. Mr. Patel would recover fully. The quick response made all the difference, she explained, looking meaningfully at Mira. That nitroglycerin spray and immediate medical attention prevented any serious damage to the heart. Priya hugged Mira suddenly, tears flowing freely. "You saved my father's life," she whispered. "How can we ever thank you?" Mira hugged her back, thinking about her own father, about how precious family is. The moment felt both big and small at the same time, just humans caring for each other the way we're supposed to. Through the window, Mira could see the park where everything had happened. It looked peaceful from up here, the morning's drama invisible from this distance. People were still walking their dogs, jogging, living their normal lives. But she knew she'd never see that bench the same way again. Mr. Patel reached for something on his bedside table. It was the family photo from his wallet. "This weekend, when my grandchildren come," he said with a gentle smile, "I'll tell them about the young runner who stopped to help their grandfather. They should know that real heroes don't wear capes. They wear running shoes and carry kind hearts." News travels fast in a small community. By the next morning, the story of what happened in the park had spread through the neighborhood like ripples in a pond. Mira noticed it first when she stopped at the corner store for water. The owner smiled warmly and refused to let her pay. "For our local hero," he said simply, waving away her protests. Her morning run felt different now. The familiar path through the park held new meaning, and she wasn't the only one who felt it. Other regular morning walkers and joggers stopped to chat, sharing their own stories of times they wished they'd known what to do in an emergency. The bench where it all happened had become a kind of landmark, with someone leaving fresh flowers there each morning. At school, her first aid teacher asked her to speak to the new class about her experience. Standing in front of her fellow students, Mira felt nervous at first, but then the words came naturally. "I just did what anyone would do," she explained, "what you all could do too." The real hero was the training that helped me recognize what was happening. The local newspaper ran a small story about it, not on the front page, but tucked inside where community news lived. They included a photo of Mira with Mr. Patel and his family, taken in the hospital garden during his recovery. The headline read simply, "Morning Run Becomes Life-Saving Journey." Mira's little sister proudly carried the clipping to school for show and tell. Her track coach used the story to talk to the team about something bigger than running times and competitions. "Being a champion isn't just about crossing finish lines," she said during practice. "It's about being ready to help others reach their finish lines too." The team responded by signing up for a first aid course together. Mr. Patel's recovery became a community celebration of sorts. The retired nurse who had helped that morning, Mrs. Kumar, visited him regularly. The boy with the red bicycle would wave to him on his way to school. Even the morning Tai Chi group had shifted their practice spot closer to his usual walking path, keeping a friendly eye out for all the morning regulars. One evening, Mira's mom came home from her hospital shift with tears in her eyes. "3 people came into the ER today," she said, hugging Mira tight. "All of them knew exactly what to do because they'd heard your story and took a first aid course. You didn't just save one life that morning, you started a chain reaction." The park installed a new emergency call box near the east entrance with a small plaque that read, "Community keeps us safe." It wasn't about Mira specifically, and she liked it better that way. It was about everyone looking out for each other, about turning a morning walk into a shared responsibility for each other's well-being. Priya started a WhatsApp group for the regular morning park visitors, creating a virtual community to match the real one. People shared their walking schedules, making sure nobody had to exercise alone if they didn't want to. The group grew quickly, full of encouraging messages and friendship. The grandchildren's weekend visit turned into a small gathering in the park. Mr. Patel, now fully recovered, walked his usual route surrounded by family and friends. Mira joined them, teaching the youngest grandchild some basic stretches while Mr. Patel told the story yet again, his eyes twinkling with life and gratitude. As the afternoon sun painted the park in warm colors, Mira watched the community she'd always known reveal itself as something even more beautiful. A network of people ready to help each other, all because one ordinary morning run turned into something extraordinary. Several weeks later, on a crisp Saturday morning, Mira stood at the starting line of her track meet, her heart beating with excitement. But this time, something was different. In the crowd of spectators, she spotted Mr. Patel and his family, sitting with their handmade sign, "Run like the wind, our everyday hero." Her coach had arranged special seats for them, close to the track. The morning sun caught the silver whistle around her neck, a gift from her first aid instructor, engraved with the date that changed everything. She'd started wearing it on her runs, not just as a reminder of that morning, but as a symbol of readiness to help others. Other runners had noticed and started carrying first aid supplies in their running belts too. Before the race began, she looked around at her fellow runners, remembering how many of them had signed up for the community first aid course that the local hospital now offered monthly. The course had become so popular, they had to add extra sessions. Even the young boy with the red bicycle had convinced his entire scout troop to take it. The starting pistol fired, and Mira ran like never before. But this time, she wasn't just running for herself. Each stride carried the strength of community, of connections made and lives touched. As she rounded the final bend, she could hear Mr. Patel's grandchildren cheering her name, their voices mixing with the general roar of the crowd. Later, during the medal ceremony, she'd won silver. Mr. Patel's youngest grandchild asked her, "Did you always want to be a hero?" Meera smiled, bending down to meet the child's eyes. "I just wanted to be helpful," she answered honestly. "And you know what? Everyone can be helpful. That's what makes our community special." The local medical center had put up a new poster in their waiting room, showing simple steps for recognizing emergency situations. At the bottom was a quote, "Sometimes the biggest differences start with the smallest choices to care." They hadn't used Meera's name, but everyone knew the story behind it. That evening, during the small celebration at her house, Meera's mom brought out a scrapbook. Inside were newspaper clippings, photos, and cards from people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of that morning. But what caught Meera's eye was a simple note from an anonymous person. "Your story made me stop and help someone today. Thank you for showing us how." The park had changed too, but in subtle ways. More people greeted each other now, made eye contact, checked on anyone sitting alone. The morning Tai Chi group had grown larger, and they'd started offering free lessons to anyone interested. The bench where everything happened had become known as the Friendship Bench, where no one sat alone for long. Mr. Patel had fully returned to his morning walks, but now he often had company. Different people would join him for parts of his route, sharing stories and creating new friendships. The park's walking paths had become more than just paths. They were threads connecting the community together. As the celebration wound down and the evening light turned golden, Meera stepped out onto her porch, her silver medal catching the last rays of sun. She could see the park in the distance, where tomorrow morning she would run again. But now she understood that sometimes the most important finish lines aren't the ones you cross with your feet, but the ones you cross with your heart. The story of that morning had become part of the community's fabric, not because it was extraordinary, but because it reminded everyone of their own capacity to make a difference. In the end, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about being human, about noticing, caring, and acting. And in that simple truth lay the real victory, greater than any medal could represent.